Now, welcome to my Dominaria set review. Today we will be going over all of the new cards from the upcoming Magic set, Dominaria. These will be coming to Magic the Gathering Arena probably shortly after they come out in actual paper Magic. Based upon how they talked about it, it seems to be pretty close. So, I thought it would be relevant to familiarize all of you with the cards that we will soon be getting access to, what I think about them, what kind of archetypes those should be played in, and all of that stuff. So I'm super excited, and we will start alphabetically with Adamant Will. Adamant Will is a 2-mana instant. Target creature gets +2/+2 and gains indestructible until the end of turn. This is a pretty reasonable limited combat trick. This probably isn't a card you're going to see in constructed level play, but in limited, this is going to be one of the things you're going to have to play around a lot. Just pretty much any combat trick in limited is going to have a fair amount of value, and this is an exception. So this is something that you're probably going to get blown out by a fair percentage of the time. I think this is like probably an above average combat trick, but it's not something that's going to really pop up and constructed too often. It's a little bit too expensive for the effect, and a lot of the relevant removal in standard already exiles. So this is something you'll see a fair amount of in limited, not really so much in constructed. Next card is Aven Sentry. Is a 4-mana 3/2 bird. This is another card you're going to be seeing. Well, you probably won't even be seeing it too much in limited, to be honest. This is the kind of thing you'll find like 14th or 13th pick, and you'll begrudgingly take because you kind of have to. But yeah, just it's a bird. It's 4-mana 3/2 bird. Not really good. Doesn't pass the vanilla test. Not something we're interested in playing. This one, Bayard, Steward of Arglaive. Bayard, Steward of Arglaive is a 4-mana 2/4 legendary human soldier with vigilance and the text: creatures can't attack you or planeswalkers you control unless their controller plays 1 mana for each of those creatures. This is an effect that has existed in Magic before in other cards, such as like Ghostly Prison, for example. And that effect is valuable. Taxing your creatures or opponent's creatures' attack is super relevant. It does slow them down a lot. Attaching that to a 2/4 body, allowing them to remove it, not super resilient, but for red decks, for toughness, the mono red deck in particular can be a flashpoint. They generally rely on a Braid pretty heavily. Most decks don't go up to Glorybringer or Chandra. So this guy could be pretty safe. He's going to largely be a sideboard card if he gets played at all. But I do think that he's going to have a fair amount of value in those sideboarded spots where he can slow down an aggressive deck. Specifically, decks that are trying to go wide and attack with a large number of creatures and protect you from kind of getting run out of the gym. So this is a card that I would definitely assume gets sideboarded in some cases, especially if you have anything to pump it. If you're already playing some white weenie deck, something like that, then this card gets better. But it's generally going to be a sideboard option, not something you can really afford to be main decking, considering how small the body is. Benalish Honor Guard. Benalish Honor Guard is a 2-mana 2/2 human knight, relevant type line. Benalish Honor Guard gets +1 attack for each legendary creature you control. This can be pretty powerful. This card can attack for a fair amount of damage if you control a bunch of legendaries. Generally, it's going to be a 3/2, probably in the most optimistic of circumstances. So this might actually be a reasonably high pick in limited for the Knight stack. It's a 2-drop. It can have 3 power. You're going to usually have enough legends to turn this on to at least get to 3 power. For constructed, not so much. Dice to Magma Spray. The upside is very hard to attain. It's pretty win more in that spot. But this will be a solid player in limited. So Benalish Marshal is one of the cycle of monocolored creatures that require triple of their colored costs to cast. He is obviously the white one. There's one for every color. In the case of Benalish Marshal, is a 3-mana trip white human knight 3/3. That gives all other creatures, regardless of type, that you control, +1/+1. That's a pretty relevant text box. Pumping your entire team is a really strong effect. Granted, he is a creature, can be removed himself, is in a Braid range. All of that stuff matters. But you're definitely going to be able to get into spots where you potentially play your other creatures first, pressure them, and then play Benalish Marshal after they tap out for a blocker or something, giving yourself a profitable attack and then jam. That's a common play pattern that comes up already with decks that have lords, such as vampires. You'll like play the tokens initially, pressure them a bit, get them to tap out for something, and then play the anthem, and at least get some amount of value out of it. So Benalish Marshal can be used in any deck that can afford to cast him at triple white, which isn't going to be a huge number of them, but there's a bunch of different creatures that you can play in white. You don't need to be devoted to one particular tribe like knights or whatever. You can play this with anything, you synergize with everything. So this is going to be one of the main incentives to play mono white if you're in the business of doing so. You could also potentially light splash one of the enemy colored lands, given the fast lands from Kaladesh and Aether Hub. Although for MTGO we may have to wait on that because it seems like Kaladesh may not be in by the time Dominaria is. So if that is the case, this will be strictly monocolored decks. You won't really have the tools to splash anything else. But even in those cases, he's going to be very powerful and really give the archetype the staying power it needs to be relevant. Next up is Blessed Light. Blessed Light is your typical overcosted removal spell for limited. Removal is such a premium in limited that it doesn't really matter how much it costs, you just want that effect. That's what Blessed Light does. It exiles a creature or enchantment. That'll matter in the limited format. Obviously not something we're interested in playing in constructed, but this will probably be a reasonably high pick in draft. Because in addition to being a exile removal spell, it also deals with enchantments, so it can potentially deal with opposing sagas, which we will get to later. I've talked about how I'm not sure that's how you exactly want to deal with sagas, but there are certainly some where getting them off the table before they hit Chapter 3 is worth it. And Blessed Light can help you do that in draft. Board the Weatherlight is a 2-mana sorcery that allows you to look at the top 5 cards of your deck. You may reveal a historic card from among them and put it into your hand, put the rest in the bottom. So, for those who don't know, historic is a new keyword in Dominaria that refers to legendary, saga, or artifact cards. So this hits a pretty wide swath of things. You could use this in a bunch of different ways. I think that the relevant subtype among historic, in this case, is artifact. This is a card you can use to enable some combo decks such as Paradox Engine in conjunction with Gilded Lotus and Power Stone, which we'll get to later. There are a bunch of mana rocks where you can now make a pretty reasonable combo deck. So if you were trying to be more consistent and find your pieces, Board the Weatherlight is going to help you there. You could also just use it as a way to find your sagas or planeswalkers in a mid-range deck if you're inclined to do that, if you think you can afford to take the turn 2 off to just look for stuff. That's a reasonable way to do this. There's a lot of flexibility in Board the Weatherlight because of how many things the historic tag hits. So I would personally, my first place my brain goes to is to artifacts, but you can definitely use this just normally in a fair way to find legends or sagas or planeswalkers or whatever you want to do. So Board the Weatherlight is a really, really good impulse effect that is definitely going to be played in something, I'm not sure what, but whenever you're just looking for more consistency, it's hard to beat the rate you find on Board the Weatherlight. Call the Cavalry is a 4-mana sorcery. Create 2 2/2 white knight creature tokens with vigilance. Now, this is actually borderline. This is definitely something I could see having play in constructed, especially alongside History of Benalia, which we will get to later. There are various incentives to be running knights, and 2/2s for 4, especially with a keyword like vigilance, is about right. Like, that's not the worst rate in the world, especially the 2 bodies being worth so much in conjunction with anthem effects like the Benelux Marshal we just saw, History of Benalia that we'll get to if you want to play Radiant Destiny. So I actually think that this card is, like, if you're in the business of playing knights, constructed playable. If you have the synergies to make the bodies worth it, you could definitely play a card like this in constructed. The rate is not that bad. You can make it work. You just want things that make knights. So while it is not the best, I wouldn't be shocked if there was a deck that had enough knight synergies that it just wanted a card to make multiple knights. Charge! Continuing the knight theme. Charge is a 1-mana instant. Creatures you control get +1/+1 until end of turn. This is just kind of your standard, like, anthem combat trick thing. This has been on other cards, like, I actually can't think of their names at the time. But this is a common effect. This will be useful, obviously, if you have a very wide board, playing with tokens. You don't even need to be playing with knights, as the art would suggest. You can, whenever makes a bunch of 1/1s, or a bunch of tokens that lets you go wide, you can play this in a Vampires deck. You can play this with Saprolings. Whatever you're trying to do to just go wide, this is reasonable. I think that in most cases, this is going to be worse than the one that exists in Ixalan that's 2 mana, that gives +1/+1, and if you have Ascend, it gives +2/+2. But this may still have a place. It's cheaper. It's likely going to be mainly a limited card, but depending upon what the go wide decks are looking for in standard, may or may not see one or two of this. How do we pronounce this? Venitent. So it's a Venitent with a D in front of it. So Venitent Trapper. I think it's close. That's as close as I'm getting. But Venitent Trapper is a 3-mana 3/2. Whenever you cast a historic spell, tap target creature and opponent controls. This is another limited card that seems pretty medium. It depends upon how many historic spells you're going to be casting. Tapping down attackers in a quasi-aggressive deck is a very powerful effect, but I'm not sure how many historic spells you're going to be able to cast, because most of the historic spells are going to be rather expensive, so you won't be able to, for example, play multiple in the same turn, which is something you could potentially do otherwise, which would be a pretty powerful effect for this card. So this seems like a pretty medium limited card, but it's something you might be interested in playing if you're playing an aggressive deck, and it's possible I'm underrating how many historic cards you could potentially play in the limited format. Donita, Capuchin Paragon. A 3-mana 2/2 with First Strike, Vigilance, Lifelink, and the text Aura and Equipment spells you cast cost 1 less to cast. This is going to be a theme we will see through various cards as we go along through the set review. There is a little bit of an enchantment sub-theme, specifically auras going on dudes, and Donita is one of those cards that incentivizes you to do that. She is actually reasonably powerful with First Strike, Lifelink, Vigilance. The fact that she dies to Magma Spray for 3 mana is really bad. That is certainly a strike against this card. But, for example, if you play this on turn 4 and then play some equipment that protects it for 1 less mana on the same turn, maybe you got something going on there. You're still exposed to Magma Spray in that spot. But I do think that given enough night synergies, if you have some Anthem effects in play, make this body a little bit bigger, this is a card that scales very well with increasing in size. And if you can do that without actually equipping things onto it and exposing it to removal, of which this is vulnerable to everything, that makes this card very powerful. So alongside Benalish Marshall, Radiant Destiny, History of Benalia, Donita becomes a lot better. And obviously, as the card would imply, you could certainly play it with equipment. Just know that you are exposing yourself to some pretty savage blowouts. Daring Archaeologist. Daring Archaeologist is a 4-mana 3/3. When Daring Archaeologist enters the battlefield, you may turn target artifact card from your graveyard to your hand. Whenever you cast a historic spell, put a +1/+1 counter on Daring Archaeologist. So the main relevant text in this card is the enters the battlefield trigger that lets you rebuy an artifact. That may or may not be relevant. Like I said, some combo decks or surrounding artifacts may exist. Maybe they would want the capacity to rebuy their artifacts that are important. This card is pretty underwhelming, though. It's a 4-mana 3/3. It can get larger, of course, but not too much too quickly. It's possible that there is some... One of the artifact combos is like bouncing and replaying a bunch of artifacts and making this a million, and then attacking with it. Seems unlikely, but that's a thing you could potentially do. There's probably better win conditions with Walking Ballista, but Daring Archaeologist seems pretty medium to me. It's not something I would expect to see a lot, but if there is a linear deck that really wants to protect certain artifacts and to maximize the ways they have to protect them, we may see some Daring Archaeologists. Dauntless Bodyguard. Now, this is a very good card. This is a 1-mana 2/1 creature human knight. See the type line knight again. As Dauntless Bodyguard enters the battlefield, choose another creature you control. Sacrifice Dauntless Bodyguard. The chosen creature gets indestructible until the end of turn. So this is a 1-mana 2/1, which you're just kind of in the business of playing if you're playing an aggressive white deck. So you just kind of play that if it didn't have any other text. But in addition to that, you have the ability to potentially protect another more important creature, such as Benalish Marshall, Donita, whatever you deem worth protecting. So on turn 1, you can play this as a 2/1, get on board, start pressuring your opponent. But if you draw this later, it actually gives you the ability to protect your more important cards and be more productive than just a vanilla 2/1. So cards like this are generally great, that are good early and still serve a purpose late. Protecting your cards that are important in a deck specifically that is trying to go wide and highly values cards like Benalish Marshall, pumping the rest of the team. Dauntless Bodyguard is definitely a very strong card and is going to be an auto-include in any white aggressive deck. Dub. Dub is a 3-mana aura enchantment. You can enchant a creature to give it +2/+2 and First Strike. and it is a knight in addition to its other types. This is something that may come up in limited. +2/+2 first strike for a 3 mana is pretty good rate. Generally, auras you're going to stay away from in constructed because removal is so prevalent, you're just going to get blown out a very high percentage of the time. But in limited, where you can expect these to resolve at a higher frequency, this seems like a solid rate for the pump effect. Giving +2/+2 in first strike is very good. First strike is going to allow this to rumble with pretty much everything. So dub may be something that we see a fair amount in limited format, especially alongside the equipment synergies that we saw on Danita and some other cards. So dub may be a reasonably high pick in limited depending upon how the Auras deck fleshes out. Evra, Hykalon Witness. This card is a bit of a meme. It is a 6 mana 4/4 legendary avatar creature with lifelink that says, for 4 mana, you can exchange your life total with Evra, Hykalon Witness's power. So, for example, if you go to turn 6 and you haven't taken damage yet, you play this, you untap, you put yourself to 4, make Evra's power 20, and kill your opponent. Now, granted, that obviously gets disrupted by everything, but if that sounds fun to you, if this is a mini quest you want to try and complete, you now have a fun card to do it. So, it's obviously probably not going to be super competitive card. It's very fragile. A lot needs to go right. You have to invest a lot to make the synergy work. You need to not take damage. So a whole bunch needs to go right in order for this card to be good, which likely is going to keep it out of the constructed spotlight. But if you want to mess around and do some cool stuff, you can play this card. Maybe it'll be a sweet brawl commander. Like, that's a possible thing. But yeah, it's fun that this card exists. It's cool that this card exists, but it is not something I would anticipate to see appear a huge amount in a competitive level play. Excavation Elephant. Excavation Element is a 5... Did I say element? I said element. Excavation Elephant is a 5 mana 3/5 elephant creature with kicker 2. When Excavation Elephant enters the battlefield, if it was kicked, return target artifact card from your graveyard to your hand. So you can play this as a vanilla 5 mana 3/5, or you can spend the additional 2 mana to get an artifact back from your graveyard. Again, this is a limited card. I'm not sure how prevalent artifacts are going to be, how many are going to get in your graveyard frequently, but just this seems like a 5 mana 3/5 is about normal body. You would be okay playing that, and the fact that you get an artifact back is just the kicker, giving this value in the late game, is pretty reasonable. Fall of Thran. Fall of Thran is a saga. I think this is the first saga we have seen so far. So, the way sagas work is that they have 3 chapters. Each chapter is denoted by the number of lore counters. Oh. And there goes Roxy. Hopefully she doesn't bark that much. So, when you play a saga initially, it gets 1 lore counter and triggers its chapter 1 ability. In the case of Fall of Thran, it destroys all the lands in play. Then you would pass the turn, and then when it comes back to your upkeep, or sorry, this triggers on the beginning of main phase 1. At the beginning of main phase 1, it would get the second lore counter triggering the chapter 2 ability, which in this case is each player returns 2 land cards from their graveyard to the battlefield. And then the same thing happens on the following turn for chapter 3, and then when chapter 3 resolves, the saga is sacrificed. All sagas have 3 chapters. All the sagas are sacrificed after the conclusion of chapter 3. So, in the case of Fall of Thran, you have a 6 mana Armageddon, destroying everyone's lands, that slowly rebuilds them. Now, there are a couple ways to abuse this card. If you have a way to exile your opponent's graveyard, for instance, after you activate the first chapter, you get lands back and they don't, because their lands are exiled. So that's a cute thing you could do to abuse this card. On even just a fair basis, it's possible that a mono-white aggressive deck might want to play this, even though it's 6 mana. They were generally the ones that played Armageddon, because the joke would be you get on board early, you like play your creatures, and then Armageddon, and then you have a board they don't, they can't do anything, they die. You could potentially do something similar with Fall of Thran, albeit being at 6 mana kind of makes that not as viable as it might otherwise be, and you're only buying yourself a couple turns because the lands do eventually come back, at least in part. So I'm not sure if you can play this in like a fair capacity, or you have to kind of only use this with exile your opponent's lands nonsense. But it is certainly interesting that we now have an Armageddon effect in Standard, or will when Dominaria comes out. So I think this card's a bit of a meme. I don't really think it's going to be super duper good and constructed unless people find a way to consistently abuse the whole your lands are gone forever, mine aren't, lol thing. Like, we'll see how that goes. Gideon's Reproach. Gideon's Reproach is a 2-mana instant that deals 4 damage to target attacking or blocking creature. This is interesting. This is not the worst card in the world. It depends on how strapped the white control decks are for 2-drop removal. Right now, we'll get to a card later that is way better than this that they're definitely going to play. But this is not a bad substitute. It'll probably be reasonable and limited. And if you really do care about 4 toughness, if you care about interacting early, you don't have better means, this is like a reasonable card. It's not the best. It's not something you would want to play, but there may be decks that, for whatever reason, can't play some of the more powerful enchantments or don't have the colors for that have the other good 2-drop removal spells. So you may be forced to play Gideon's Reproach, and if you're forced to do that, it's not great, but this is playable. So it may work. It's not like people have played more embarrassing cards than Constructed. Probably won't show up, and you don't want to play it, but there may be decks that are strapped for whatever reason on the ability to run other removal spells that may get towards Gideon's Approach. Probably just for limited, though. Healing Grace. Healing Grace is a 1-mana instant that prevents the next 3 damage that would be dealt to any target this turn by a source of your choice, and you gain 3 life. This is a pretty medium combat trick. It could save a creature. It doesn't make your stuff bigger, though. It's hard to leverage this. Generally, you want your combat tricks to add power, so because people aren't going to really attack into things with enough power to kill their creatures unless they're already comfortable with the trade. So this may prevent your thing from dying, but it's not really ever going to trade for an opposing card. So generally, my assumption would be that this card is not very good in any format, limited or constructed. But I'm not very good at limited, so maybe I'm wrong. But this seems pretty bad, so I would advise against playing this. Now we get to one of the better cards in white, one of the cards I mentioned earlier in History of Benalia. History of Benalia is another saga that we just saw like Fall of Thran. Chapter 1 on History of Benalia is create a 2/2 white knight creature token. Same as Chapter 2. So the way History of Benalia works is you play it, 2/2 immediately comes into play, go to next turn, 2/2 again, and then Chapter 3, all knights you control get +2/+1 until end of turn. So, for example, the 4-mana make 2/2 knight token spell we saw before interacts very well with this card, because you can play History of Benalia on 3, get your 2/2 knight, untap, get the second knight for free, play the token generator to make 2 more knights, and then the following turn attack for a comically high number. So that's why, even though the card we saw before may not be super good constructed rate in normal circumstances, because of how good History of Benalia is and how likely we are to see this a lot, and its synergy with that card, the curve out I just mentioned, we're likely going to see that, and we're definitely going to see History of Benalia making a bunch of other cards that may or may not have been good enough themselves, good enough. So History of Benalia is likely going to be something we see a lot. It's going to be something that makes white aggro a thing, like pretty much by itself. So get used to seeing History of Benalia, and there isn't really a great way to answer this card. For example, say you wanted to deal with this saga, you get the knight regardless. So if I play History of Benalia, I get a 2/2 knight, and then they could play a naturalize or whatever enchantment destruction effect. I still have my knight, so they're down a 2/2 on that exchange. I'm not sure if that's like the axis you want to fight sagas on, and I think because of that, people will be apprehensive to even contest sagas on that axis, and these might go unopposed more often than not. So I think sagas are going to be a super duper strong part of the new coming format, and History of Benalia is one of the better ones. Invoke the Divine. Invoke the Divine is a 3-mana instant. Destroy target artifact or enchantment. You gain 4 life. This is another option for destroying artifacts or enchantments. I know that the other option in white would be Forsake the Worldly, I forget if Forsake the Worldly is instant, but there's usually a couple of these in the given format, and you have to decide, oh, do I want to gain life or exile or have the ability to cycle? They all have like their own upside that are all of approximate value, and then you have to decide for yourself situationally based upon what your deck is trying to do, what you care about, which one you actually want to run. So this will come up. If people care about gaining the life, if the decks against which they're trying to destroy artifacts and enchantments are also pressuring their life total. If that's ever the case, you would want this instead of Forsake the Worldly. I'm not sure specifically when that would be the case, but this is one of the things that'll show up in the format, just naturalizes with upside, and then you get to figure out which one you want to run for yourself. So whenever your life total is being pressured by things that run artifacts and enchantments, you'll probably sideboard in Invoke the Divine. Knight of Grace. Knight of Grace is a 2-mana 2/2, first strike human knight, with hexproof from black, so black spells and abilities cannot target Knight of Grace. Knight of Grace also gets +1/+0 as long as any player controls a black permanent. So this is one of 2 knights that were printed in this set, a white one and a black one, that both get better if you control, if anyone has permanents of the opposing color. So you could either play a white-black deck, play each other, fuel each other, and have cool knights, or you could just use this as a 2-mana 2/2 with first strike with the knight type line, and then whenever you play against an opponent with black cards, it gets better. Either seem viable to me, especially considering the payoffs that exist for playing mainly white cards, especially mono white, so you may not be incentivized to splash black for enabling this card, like giving it more power. There's enough black cards just floating around in the format generally. Black is probably one of the strongest colors, so you're going to just see things in general with this. But yeah, Knight of Grace is very strong. Having first strike, especially a potential 3 power first striker on turn 2, is very, very good. This is going to be a part of the History of Benalia deck we just talked about. There's a lot of knight support in this set. We're going to be seeing a huge amount of it. So get used to seeing Knight of Grace. It'll come up a lot, and it is a very strong card, one of the better payoffs for playing a mono-white aggressive deck. Knight of New Benalia, 2-mana 3/1 vanilla. This is mainly for limited. You'll still have some of the knight sub-themes in limited if you want to build a knight deck. This is just a 2-drop knight. It's good enough. This will just be like a 2-drop filler for whatever proactive white deck you're trying to build limited. It seems totally fine. Quendi, Pride of Femeref. Figured it out. Quendi, Pride of Femeref, is a legendary 4-mana human knight 2/2 creature. With double strike, it makes it so creatures you control with first strike have double strike. This is a neat card for limited. Again, it is a 4-mana card that dies to Magma Spray that doesn't fly in constructed, especially when it doesn't do anything when it enters the battlefield. So yeah, it's a bit of a win more card. If you have a board of multiple creatures with first strike, that was probably good enough. Like, you're probably ahead. You probably don't need double strike. So I'm not sure when this comes up. It seems like not the best card. Dies really easily to the universe. There's not a huge amount of first strike creatures. He does interact well with the knight we just talked about that does that first strike. Giving that double strike is pretty decent. But again, you have to play a 4-mana 2/2 in order to do that. Not something I would personally be interested in. So this is not something I expect to see in constructed. Probably come up in limited just because 4-mana 2/2 double strike in limited is like playable. That's fine, especially if you're putting equipment on it, which is a much more viable strategy in limited. Then we're talking. A lot of the things that make this potentially good don't really fly in constructed. So not a card I expect that we'll see a huge amount of in competitive. Now we get to Lyra Dawnbringer. I talked about this a bit before, but I wasn't recording then, so we're going to talk about it again. So, Lyra Dawnbringer is a 5-mana 5/5 legendary flying angel with flying, first strike, and lifelink. Other angels you control have +1/+1 and lifelink. This is, for anyone who has been playing Magic for a bit, very reminiscent of Baneslayer Angel. It is actually exactly Baneslayer Angel, with the exceptions of being legendary and having the protection from dragons and demons text replaced with other angels get +1/+1 and lifelink text. This is going to rule creature combat. Any matchup where attacking and blocking matters, where you're trying to damage race, Lyra's winning the race. Doesn't matter what you're doing, Lyra's winning the race. So this is going to be just ruling everything. There are a few creatures that are very good that are at 6/6 that do outclass Lyra, but they generally cost more than Lyra. So when you're dealing with like mid-range threats, for example, red-green monsters, Red-green monsters gets colded by this card. Like Rekindling Phoenix Glorybringer, doesn't matter. I play Lyra Dawnbringer, you can't attack anymore. No creature in your deck has profitable attacks against Lyra Dawnbringer. And they could obviously do stuff to modulate that with Resilient Kenra, or maybe 2-for-1 themselves with an Abrade or something. But in general, this card is going to be a huge problem for those mid-rangey creature decks like red-green monsters, because it just beats the entire deck in combat. So this is going to be a really huge tool for control decks to side into if they want, for mid-range white decks to stabilize the board. Just Baneslayer Angel has a pretty good track record of being really good when creature combat matters, and it is certainly possible that we get to a spot in Standard where creature combat doesn't matter in a wide array of matchups. If that's the case, Lyra's going to be much worse, because just a 5/5 that attacks and blocks. But whenever we're attacking and blocking, Lyra's going to be really good. Lyra's going to get it done. And none of this is even accounting for her second line of text, giving all of the angels +1/+1 lifelink. There is a 4-drop angel that we will get to later that this card synergizes incredibly well with. But there actually aren't really that many other angels outside of that one. But those two in conjunction, very strong. So we'll get to some other angel synergies if you want to build a deck around that. There are some tools to do that, but not a huge amount. Generally, just me playing Lyra because she is a 5-mana 5/5 flying first strike lifelink that beats the universe in combat. And that's really good. Mesa Unicorn, the 2-mana 2/2 lifelink. Unfortunately, not a horse to synergize with the 5-mana make your horses indestructible card, whose name I'm forgetting. But yeah, this is another card that's mainly used to be for limited. It's a 2-drop, seems reasonable. Depending upon the texture of the white decks, this may or may not be a reasonable one to play. Based on what we've seen so far, it seems like there aren't really a lot of 2-drops with 3 toughness, so 2/2 seems to be about the rate that they'll be able to trade up with things and stuff. So seems like a reasonable 2-drop for limited. On Sarah's Wings. On Sarah's Wings is a 4-mana legendary enchantment aura. Lets you enchant a creature to make it legendary and give it +1/+1 flying, vigilance, and lifelink. So you kind of get to make your own Lyra Dawnbringer if you have a 4/4 of any kind. This is an enchantment that is good enough to potentially see play in Constructed if you have other synergies around it. The text box on this is so good that it may work if you're putting it on something with hexproof, or can protect it in some fashion with like Blossoming Defense, which will get an Aether Revolt. So I think that this card is definitely bonkers unlimited. This card is slam dunk, like pick one, pack one, probably unlimited. They'll just win the game with this card. In Constructed, I think it's like really close. Depending upon what other synergies are there, this is potentially playable. Like we already saw Danita, Capuchin, Paragon. That makes this 3 mana. You can then leave up more mana to protect it. Potentially, if there's anything that lets you draw a card from playing this to insulate yourself from removal, etc. So, it doesn't take a lot to make this card good enough for Constructed, based upon what synergies are available. But yeah, pick one, pack one. This unlimited, you'll just murk everybody. Pegasus Courser. Pegasus Courser, 3 mana 1/3 flying. Whenever Pegasus Courser attacks another attacking creature, it gains flying until end of turn. This is similar to another card that did this, whose name I forget. But this is actually a little bit better than it looks because of how good flying is in limited, where you can just play like one of the 2-drops we've seen before, like the 2 mana 3/1 Knight, for example. And as a 3/1, it can't really attack into a lot. Like your opponent can play like the Saplings, and then your 3/1 is deaded. But if you play Pegasus Courser, you can now attack in the air with the 3/1. Its low toughness doesn't matter as much anymore because it has evasion. And now you're doing a lot of damage in the air. So this is actually a much more reasonable card in limited than it looks. Obviously not for Constructed, but this is a card that people will probably sleep on, and I think will be likely not one of the more important cards of the mono white deck or the white aggressive deck in limited, but a solid role player. Sanctum Spirit. Sanctum Spirit is a 4 mana 3/2 with lifelink. Discard a historic card. Sanctum Spirit gains indestructible until end of turn. Now, the interesting part about this is that it's a 0 mana discard outlet, which can break stuff. I'm not sure off the top of my head what this could potentially synergize with. Probably some kind of scrap trawler deck, but if you're playing this fairly, if you just like are discarding cards to protect your 3/2 lifelink, that doesn't really play. Like that's not good. But if having a 0 mana discard outlet enables some kind of recursion loop with some manner of combo, that's what I'm interested in. And then this also protects itself as part of the combo. So this is a card I would start looking at the various other cards in Standard to see if there's any kind of combo recursion loop thing going on that you could potentially enable. Outside of that, if you're just playing this fair to try and like preserve your 3/2 lifelink, it's not my jam. So Seal Away. Seal Away is the 2-mana removal spell I was talking about before that's saying you're probably going to play this instead of the Gideon's Reproach. So Seal Away is a 2-mana enchantment with flash, meaning you can cast it at instant speed. When Seal Away enters the battlefield, exile target tapped creature an opponent controls until Seal Away leaves the battlefield. So Seal Away is obviously in direct competition with Baffling End. They do very similar things. The upside for Seal Away is that it can hit any creature as long as it's tapped. It doesn't have the 3 CMC breakpoint that Baffling End does. The downside of Seal Away is it can not deal with some creatures that don't need to tap to be effective. For example, things that we're going to see in Aether Revolt. Glintsleeve Siphoner can still draw cards without attacking. Hangerback Walker can be very effective without attacking. There's certainly a bunch of other ones that I'm currently not thinking about. Things with Vigilance, for example. So there is a cost running Seal Away. There really is like this interesting push and pull between this and Baffling End. It's also worth noting that Baffling End can deal with mana creatures before they tap for mana, accelerating your opponent. Seal Away cannot. So I actually think it's going to be interesting to see what split of this and Baffling End people play in their white decks. You definitely want to play a bunch of these. Like you probably want like 3 and 3, like 6 total at least of this effect, considering how proactive the format looks like it's going to be. But Seal Away is definitely going to come up a lot. It synergizes very well, especially with Teferi, who we will talk about later. It's a very good card alongside Teferi. And one of the cards we're going to be seeing a huge amount in white control decks. It having flash is a big deal. That'll matter a lot. But again, like I said, there's a lot of interesting push and pull words, push and pull between this and Baffling End that will make deck building compelling. Sergeant at Arms is a 3-mana 2/3 with Kicker 3. When Sergeant at Arms enters the battlefield, if it was kicked, create 2 1/1 white soldiers. This is a solid limited card. Just a 3-mana 2/3, not the best, but Kicker is very, very strong and limited because of how amorphous your curve is. Having things that are reasonable to play early and reasonable to play late, just based on that flexibility, like regardless of what the rates of either of those things are, just having that flexibility to be good at all stages of the game is really strong and limited considering how hodgepodge your deck is. So even though a 3-mana 2/3 is not really something that's super exciting, and a 6-mana 2/3 that makes 2 1/1s is not super exciting, it's better than it looks just based on the flexibility. Now, this card in particular, not super powerful, despite the kicker. But again, having that flexibility, being able to do stuff later when you flood out or draw this later, just is a lot stronger than it looks. Sarah Angel. Sarah Angel would be familiar to anyone who's been playing Magic at all in the past, like, very long time. Sarah Angel is a 5-mana 4/4 flying vigilance. It's kind of like the vanilla angel. I think it might be actually the vanilla angel. Is Sarah Angel the first angel? I'm sure chat will tell me. Anyway, this is bonkers and limited. It's been bonkers and limited forever. It's just really good. It's just like one of the most efficient attackers that you're going to see in limited. So yeah, this is probably, maybe not pick one, pack one, but definitely a very high priority pick in limited. If you're playing white, Sarah Angel is really, really good at giving people the business. So definitely prioritize highly limited. Not good enough for Extracted anymore, unfortunately, Bible Thump. But definitely prioritize that if you are drafting white limited. Sarah Disciple, 2-mana 1/1 flying first strike bird cleric. Whenever you cast a historic spell, Sarah's Disciple gets +1/+1 until end of turn. This is a pretty medium limited card. Like again, like the other card that we saw earlier that tapped creatures when you played historic spells. Historic spells are generally going to be expensive because they're like legendary, they're artifacts. Most sagas are expensive. You're not going to be really able to multi-spell turn these, so you get a 2-power flyer for the synergy without really much more ceiling than that. seems medium to me. I'm not really sure how much you prioritize this. It does have first strike. That does matter. It's going to be able to attack another flyers. If there are any other 3/1 flyers in the format, this blocks those very well. So this might be a part of the... this depends upon a lot about what a lot of other things going on in the format are. We'll have to see more about the limited format, get a better sense of it before I can really properly evaluate this card, but it seems pretty medium to me. Oh, here we go. Shalai, Voice of Plenty. This is the card I was talking about that is very good alongside Lyra. Curving Shalai into Lyra pretty much locks red-green monsters out of the game. They are just dead. They're just dead. So Shalai, Voice of Plenty is a 4-mana 3/4 flying legendary angel. You and your planeswalkers and other creatures you control have hexproof, meaning they cannot be targeted by effects your opponents control. And for 4 double green, you can put a 1/1 counter on each creature you control. This card is pretty good. The drawback on it is that it's at 4 toughness, which is a flashpoint in the format. It dies to Glorybringer and it dies to Chandra. But if it survives the turn and you get to untap and play Lyra, Lyra pumps this to 5 toughness, making it much more resilient to the common removal in the format. And this gives Lyra hexproof, so Lyra can't really die either. So, specifically in the case I mentioned against red-green monsters, they're locked out. They're done. They can't attack anymore. And then you can just like keep pumping your dudes until you have a profitable attack. So this card is going to definitely show up, largely because it synergizes so well with Lyra, but the fact that it protects your other cards, forces them to go through this first, and also acts as a mana sink in the late game, are a lot of powerful effects put into one creature. So we're definitely going to see a fair amount of Shalai, especially alongside Lyra, playing it in a white-green deck where you have Landmore Elves. You want mana sinks anyway, so you don't flood out because of all the mana sources you're running. Shalai synergizes very well with a lot of the other powerful cards in the format. Tashar, Ancestor's Apostle. Now, we were just talking about that discard outlet. If that's a deck, it might involve this guy. So Tashar, Ancestor's Apostle is a 4-mana 2/2 legendary bird cleric with flying, and whenever you cast a historic spell, return target creature card with converted mana cost 3 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. So I know that there's some talk of this in Modern, where it's much easier to like loop this with things, but it's possible we see some stuff with Constructed. Again, this is a card you want to be trying to cultivate some combo around. If you're just playing it fair, like on turn 4, here's my 4-mana 2/2, untap, play like a 5-mana artifact, get a 3-cost thing back. Like that doesn't really play in Constructed in the year 2018. But if you have some upside on it, if sometimes you do that, but you can also build towards this combo, whatever that may be, trying to form some recursion loop, then we're talking. I still have to investigate some things. Like I haven't really dove into this card a whole bunch yet. I know a bunch of other people have. There'll probably be some content on it. But this is a card that only really plays if you're comboing off with it. Playing a 4-mana 2/2 in Constructed, not really a thing unless it's surviving means you win the game. So look for combos with this card. It certainly seems like something that isn't the hardest in the world to abuse, granted how many cheap artifacts there are, especially in Eternal formats. In Standard, probably going to be harder to get some value out of, but potentially. We do have a Mox that we will talk about later. Tragic Poet. Tragic Poet is a 1-mana 1/1. Sacrifice Tragic Poet, return target enchantment card from your graveyard to your hand. The main use I see for this card is recurring sagas. Sagas are very good things to recur just because of how much value they get. They trigger 3 times. You trigger, in a fair amount of cases, being worth a card. So Tragic Poet, being able to recur that is a lot of value. Not to the point where I would really consider playing this in Constructed unless your deck centers around a saga and you really want to see it multiple times. But this is definitely a card that would be reasonable to play in Limited. Just a thing to do on turn 1, maybe hold some stuff back, like block that 3/1, for example. And then in the late game, you could rebuy like your History of Benalia you were like lucky enough to draft or whatever. So seems like a solid Limited card. Synergizes very well with sagas. Triumph of Gerard. Triumph of Gerard is a 2-mana saga. Chapters 1 and 2 put a 1/1 counter on target creature you control with the greatest power. And then Chapter 3, target creature you control with the greatest power gains flying, first strike, and lifelink until the end of turn. This can be worth a pretty large amount of damage. It doesn't trade with anything by itself, is the downside of this card. If you don't have creatures in play, it doesn't do anything. Your opponent can just kill the creatures, the counters, or the Chapter 3 trigger goes on. So this is very vulnerable to interaction on your opponent's side. Like, it just stow nothing if they have stuff. But when they don't have stuff, you could send a pretty big dude flying in the air with lifelink to, like, win a race. This card does seem pretty strong and limited, where removal is less prevalent. So, Triumph of the Gerard seems like a reasonably high pick for limited. May or may not show up constructed. Have to see what the texture of the white decks looks like. I would assume not. Maybe a sideboard option for matchups that are about racing. Like, this card, for example, would be very good against Merfolk, if Merfolk ends up being a deck constructed. So, we might see some amount of this constructed, probably not a lot. Definitely seems much more suited for winning races in limited. Urza's Ruinous Blast. Urza's Ruinous Blast is a legendary sorcery. There's a new cycle of legendary sorceries in Dominaria, one for each color, and then a white-black one. We'll talk about all of them. The first one we're going to get to is this one, Urza's Ruinous Blast. It is a 5-mana legendary sorcery, and for those who don't know, legendary sorceries can only be cast if you control a legendary creature or planeswalker. And if you meet that requirement, you get to exile all non-land permanents that are not legendary. So this is very good at exiling sagas, artifacts, normal creatures. The biggest strike against this card is that it doesn't exile the Scarab God. Scarab God dodges this. It does exile all of the things that Scarab God embalmed. It exiles any creatures in play, so the Scarab God can't eternalize them. And it can be a one-sided sweeper if you build your deck correctly. You can build a deck with like Lyra and Shalai and whatever other legends you can play to fill out the curve, and then you have Urza's Ruinous Blast that never kills any of your own things, but will kill some amount of your opponent's things, even if they have 1 or 2 legendaries as well. So that's mainly what I would see Urza's Ruinous Blast use being, kind of like a mid-range breaker that you play in matchups like that, similar to how Dune Blast was played in the Abzan mirrors. For those who don't know, Dune Blast was a 6-mana card that destroyed all creatures except 1 on either side, or 1 total, I forget. But it was a similar dynamic to that, where you build your deck in consideration of the fact that you still want to play creatures, but you can make those creatures resilient to the sweeper you run and then catch your opponent off guard. So Urza's Ruinous Blast takes some work to not only cast, but cast profitably, but the upside on it is certainly very high.